Hello my friends, Bob Lee here today. I want to share some basic information about my lathe.
So let me get started. Now, this is an old Craftsman lathe that I own, and it's nothing special except to me. It was given to me by my parents when I was very young. But to know what you're working with when you want to buy a lathe, there's some basic information you probably need to consider. How big it is, what it'll do, things like that. Now, and this doesn't change from lathe to lathe. It does in its measurements, but not the information. Okay, this is the bed of my lathe, this round tube. From this center of the headstock to the bed measures 6 inches. So this means that this lathe should be able to turn a 12-inch bowl. Between centers, this lathe will stretch out to 37 inches between centers. So that means you should be able to turn a spindle 36 inches without a problem. Now, my particular lathe is a 4-speed lathe. It's belt driven, and therefore it only has the choice of 4 speeds, and I have to change them manually. I don't know what the speeds are because the pulley sizes are different from what was stock. But I use the slowest speed for sanding, and I use my upper speeds for turning. Now, some of the other basic information on a lathe you may want to know is how you can change it to adapt to newer technology today. And in my case, I wanted to update my lathe. Now, when I updated my lathe, I had to know what the threads were on my headstock, the count, the size. What it turns out to be is mine is 3/4 by 16 threads per inch. Now, I am not promoting any particular brand, but when I started looking around, one of the brands that I found that would allow me to adapt to my lathe was the Nova Series G3. Now, it comes with several different adapters. You have to know which one it is. So basically all this does is the adapter can thread on, and then the Nova chuck threads on to the adapter. So that takes an old lathe and makes it a little bit more modern. Something else that I did was I installed a new live center on my lathe. This one has ball bearings built into it, and it gave the lathe a more smoother running effect on spindle projects and project handles and things like that, because the old lathe didn't have this.
Okay, one of the other things that I wanted to tell you about my Craftsman lathe here is that it is a #1 taper. But this #1 taper is made for the older, smaller lathes. The new lathes that are being produced today are what they call a #2 taper. And they'll be in the specifications as #2 MT. That's about double this size. So the #1 tapers are a little harder to find for accessories and aftermarket things. So it's not impossible, because I've been able to update this lathe fairly well with the ball bearing centers, and you can still buy these chucks like this with the #1 taper. The only thing about this is a 3/8 chuck and not a 1/2 inch because of this taper. They don't want you, for some reason, installing a 1/2 inch chuck on these smaller lathes. That's why they make the number 2 taper the way they do, because it comes with a 1/2 inch chuck.
Okay, I'm back. Now, this little lathe is what was referred to as an 812, and it's from Harbor Freight. Now, I'm not promoting Harbor Freight lathes, but this particular little lathe is the one I use for turning my pens on. And the reason why I kind of like this little lathe is the speed control on it. I have a direct drive motor with a variable speed switch over here on the end. This little lathe is capable of going to as high as around 3,000 RPMs to as low as 800. And all I do is flip a switch and dial it to what I want. Now, it doesn't have a digital readout, but you just kind of have to get the feel, if you will, for the speed of the lathe.
The one thing I want you to understand about this little lathe is there is a belt on here that's directly connected to my power head, but there's no changing of the belts on this particular little lathe. So this particular lathe is a very cheap version of some of the more expensive lathes that have the digital readout and that are variable speed. So I don't have to change any belts in this drive head at all. It's all done with the variable speed motor. Now, both lathes have a 3rd horse motor on them, so I can stall them out if I get too aggressive with my cuts. But the thing that I need to do is to keep my tools sharp so that I don't have to increase the motor sizes on these smaller lathes. But this particular lathe is also a number 1 taper for my pen mandrels. The other thing that's good about this is I've got a mandrel saving number 1 taper for my tailstock for this particular lathe. But the information that I'm trying to share about my lathes is what the numbers mean. It's the idea that the numbers on the lathes all change to represent different specifications, but they all conform to the same idea. How much distance you got between the center to the bed, and how many inches you got between this center to this center. That's what describes every lathe. Every wood lathe falls under that category. Now, some of them do make heads that swing out and swivel that can cut larger bowls, saucers, whatever. Those are specialty lathes, and they have to be built in. That particular thing has to be built into the lathe to be able to do that. But there's just a lot of common everyday lathes out there that are basically just set up the way these two are, and that's what I just wanted to convey to any beginning woodworkers, that whenever you go out hunting for a lathe, you have to figure out what you want to do and what you are trying to accomplish with your woodworking and your lathe turning. Well, I want to thank you for watching, and if you like what you see, please subscribe. You have a great evening now.